Foiling in strong winds can be super scary and off-putting. You need the right technique, the right equipment and the right setup of your gear to make it comfortable and easy to control even in strong winds. Welcome guys to this video of how to control the foil in strong wind. We're still in Tarifa obviously, and we have finally a long period of Levante wind, which is the offshore wind that can blow really strong with up to 60 knots here in Tarifa. And for today I'm on a mission to push my speeds on the foil, and I'm going to take you along and give you some tips along the way of what I do both on my settings and my technique to keep the foil and the whole setup really stable. So let's get started. So guys, I'm gonna talk first about the sail, and while I'm rigging up I'm gonna explain to you what I'm looking forward in the sail to make my flight as stable as possible. So I'm using race foil sails, and there's actually a big difference nowadays between foil sails and let's say regular fin sails. So you really want to be using a foil sail if you can, because these sails are much more high aspect ratio, and what that means is that they have a shorter boom and a longer luff. And this high aspect ratio actually helps to keep the nose down during your flight, whereas if you use a slalom sail during foiling, the nose will tend to lift up. And of course you do want the lift on the fin, but you do not want it on the foil. However, if you're not using a designated foil sail, there's luckily some things you can do to make your sail better suited for foiling. And that is that you don't want to put the maximum downhaul, because if you put the maximum downhaul, then the sail tends to lift up the nose even more. So you want to do a little bit less downhaul, and also you want to pull the outhaul a little bit more.
So let's dive a bit deeper into this. Having a high aspect sail with a bit longer luff and a shorter boom tends to keep the nose down and makes for a more stable flight. If we simplify it, the area in the top of the sail tends to put forward leverage on the mast and pushes the nose down. Similarly, if we use a non-foiling sail for foiling and put a lot of downhaul onto the sail, the top area of the sail just releases the wind and will not create leverage onto the nose of the board. Hence, the nose tends to fly more. The solution of putting less downhaul yet doesn't always work, as fin sails are designed to work with this amount of downhaul, and the whole sail can stop working well with less downhaul. If we want to spin this high aspect versus low aspect a bit further, we want a high aspect sail in foiling because they tend to have more glide. This means that in a wind hole, the wind tends to continue flowing optimally around a high aspect sail, whereas a low aspect sail is more affected by wind holes. The reason why we want to have a somewhat lower aspect sail on the fin is that these sails tend to create more backhand, meaning they can power the fin better. In foiling, the last thing we want to do is actively powering the foil. The power of the foil comes from the foil itself, but this we will discuss in the technique section later in the video.
So here we have the rigged sail, and I got a couple more tips about the sail for you. The first thing I do if the wind gets stronger, I actually like to put the boom way down. So you can see right here that the boom is not near my head height, but I'm actually putting it a lot lower. And what this does, it gives me less of this up and down movement and doesn't tend to lift the nose as much. Of course you need some power for that, but for strong wind, this really helps to control the foil. Then, as you can see, I'm using an outhaul system here. And I don't actually like to put the sail fully loose like I sometimes tend to do on fin. So I do pull a little bit here on this outhaul to keep the sail locked in. It will not flap around, and this gives me much more stability. And the last and probably most important thing of my trim on the sail are the harness lines. And I needed to learn this the hard way as well, that you need to use very long harness lines. Why is that? This has to do a lot with the technique and stance on the foil. You don't want to be really pushing the foil, especially on the back leg. You don't want a lot of power. What tends to happen if you make the harness lines super low is that you can put a lot of pressure through the harness lines onto your hip, and you want the pressure there and not going through your legs onto the back leg. So naturally, if I use longer harness lines, I tend to immediately go into the right stance on the foil, which looks more or less, I cannot show, and how this looks like you can see right here. I'm using by 0.7 the F1 Pro harness lines you can see here with the double clamp cleat system, and this gives me a very huge range to adjust easily the length of the harness lines. So these lines I have right here range from 26 all the way to 48 inches, and I can adjust on both sides, so whichever hand I have free I can use to adjust the harness lines and immediately change the length of the harness lines to determine what is the right length for the conditions and the gear that I'm on. Also, if you're looking for control in strong winds, you don't want to be using a too big sail. I'm using a 5/8 right here, and we have around 20 to 25 knots today. On fin gear I would use a 7/0 or maybe even a 7/8. So I tend to go around 2 square meters smaller than I go on the fin. And guys, the last thing that really helped me to get into the right stance for foiling is this harness right here, the Liberty X harness. This is kind of a hybrid. I'm going to put it on even though it's salty and wet, but everything for the video, right? So this one is actually too big for me. But this is a hybrid between a seat and a waist harness. And you can see that the hook position is much lower than it is on a comparable waist harness. And this lower position also helps to get into the right stance for foiling, meaning that you can really put the pressure of the sail onto your hips and not through your legs on the board. And this gives you much more stability, less of this flying around. And the harness does not have any straps, which is also super nice. It just has this thing over your butt right here, which you can tighten like this. And then it will also not move around, so you don't need to do this pushing down motion that you do a lot of times on the waist harness. This is actually also the harness that around 50% probably in the PWA fleet are using right now, because it's just simply the best harness, especially for foiling. And guys, I'm actually importing this harness, so if you're interested in getting one yourself, write to my mail down below, contact@nils-bach.com. It also helps out this channel, so thank you. When it comes to the boards, you basically have 3 points of contact. You have the mast base, where the sail is going, then you have the front foot strap and the back foot strap. And it's really hard to give a general recommendation of where to put the foot straps, because this depends largely on what foil you're using, with what fuselage, and where the pressure point of your foil is. So it can be that with one foil you put the foot straps all the way in the front, with another foil you put it all the way in the back because you're lacking power or you want more power. But generally what helps in foiling is that you put the foot straps a little bit further apart than you would when you go fin sailing. So I have the front foot straps all the way in the front, and then in the back foot straps I'm actually a special case as I'm not using back foot straps, and probably this is a mistake and I need to change it, but I crashed a couple times really badly because I got stuck in the back foot strap. And what this allows me to do is that I can still have my feet right here, but if I get overpowered I can just put them a little bit further inward, and this puts off the pressure of the foil and gives me the control back again. So this is why I'm doing this, but of course you have a little bit more control with back foot straps, so this is just my personal thing. And then the mast base position, same like the foot strap position, also depends what sail you're using, and also again on the foil. So for my foil I'm using a Patrick Ian foil, around 135. I have a scale here on the board. This is the perfect position. If you guys have questions how to set it up for your foil, just write down below in the comments. I know some of the foils, so maybe I can give you advice. But yeah, just play around with it and see if your foil is very powerful. You need to move it further to the front so that it's pushing down the foil a bit. Similar with the foot straps, move them a little bit further to the front. If your foil is lacking power, put everything a bit more to the back. Then the last piece of equipment, and obviously as you can imagine even the most important, is the foil. Setting up your foil perfectly is really the biggest factor to if you're being able to control your gear on the water. So let's talk about how to tune our foil so that we can get the maximum stability out of it even in strong winds. First of all, of course, the foil you're using makes a big difference. What you want to be looking for if you want to be able to control the foil in strong winds is obviously a very stiff foil. And that means in this direction, that the foil mast is not bending too much. And then the other thing that's important is the torsion of the foil. So this means this movement right here, that there's the least amount of torsion, so you're not able to bend it a whole lot this way. There's very expensive foils out there, like this Patrick model right here with the titanium fuselage and the thin mast, because as you can imagine, if you make a very thin and fast mast, it will be harder to make it super stiff. So if you want to save on budget, you can also go with options that are a little bit thicker, the profiles both of the wings, the mast and the fuselage, but that have a lot of stiffness and control. Like for example, the foil that I've been using before was a little bit thicker, both the mast and also the wings, but the foil had a lot of control. It was just maybe 1 1 or 2 knots slower than this current one I have. But if you're not looking for the last knot of speed, you don't need to go with the most expensive foil. You just need to look for a foil that is decent in the stiffness. So let's talk about the settings of our foil that give us control on the water. First, let's talk about the rake. So the rake of the foil means the angle that this plane of the fuselage right here has to the board. And what you want to achieve here while riding is that basically the position of your feet and the mast base position are on one line. So for this, generally you need a little bit of rake, meaning that the foil is tilted this way, like you can see right here. And you can actually measure that super easily, even with an app on your phone. So I just downloaded one right here, and then I'm measuring here the angle, which is 4.0 degrees, and then I'm measuring it right here, which is half a degree. So I have 3.5 degrees of rake on my foil, which is perfect for this setup. If you feel that the nose is diving into the water from time to time, you might want to rake your foil a little bit more. On the contrary, if you're feeling that your nose is sticking up too much into the air, this will cause drag, and then you want to put a little bit less rake. But generally, from the base settings most foils come in, you want to put a little bit more rake usually.
The other setting that we can adjust is the angle between the front and back wing. On most foils, this is done by adjusting the angle of the back wing, or stabilizer. The more angle we give the back wing, the more power we will perceive on our front leg. The less angle we put on the back wing, the more you will need to push on the back leg to keep the foil flying. So, depending on the wind strength, sail size and trim, the angle on our back wing can and should change. If you have trouble with always digging the nose into the water, you might want to increase the angle of the back wing. If you have trouble with the foil popping out of the water, you might want to decrease the angle of the back wing.
All right, let's go over to the beach and see if we can get some speeds today.
So while I'm heading out here, let's talk a bit about the technique you need on the foil to stay in control. The main thing you want to do is not power the foil with your legs to stay in control. I said before that you'll want to use longer harness lines to gain control over your foil. Increasing the length of the harness lines will somewhat automatically steer you into the right technique for foiling, as with longer lines you will not load up the foil so much through your legs. Look at these two shots right here. One on fin, one on foil. The shot on the fin, I'm using 28-inch harness lines. The result is that I have loads of excess power and I can really push with my legs on the fin, making the board fly. On the foiling shot, you can see me doing the opposite. I have around 38-inch harness lines here, depowering the foil and using my body weight to hang on the boom. This instantly gives me much more control because I don't load up the foil by translating the power from my sail through my legs onto the board and foil. I recommend you use adjustable harness lines as well and play around with these settings to feel the difference for yourself. As for the session, the wind was actually kind of funky and did not fully come through on the first day of Levante here, so we had mostly around 15 to 20 knots. Not super powered, honestly. I had 31 knots top speed for those of you that are curious, but still, it was a really fun session. Thanks to my sponsors and Patreons. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and I'll see you again for the next one.